Hi, everyone. Welcome officially. Thank you for joining us. And for folks who are watching this later, we're super excited to have this next edition of our virtual symposium. And so excited to have our guest here. To just a little bit of what we'll do in the next hour. I'm going to give just a little bit of an overview and some tech housekeeping. Then we'll focus on our presentation today, deepening our history, implementing Illinois inclusive curriculum law. There is a social happy hour later for folks who would like to join. I'll share the link at the end if you'd like to hop on and get a chance to see each other or to chat and network a little bit more. But the majority of our time will be spent with this workshop and presentation. I'm Bex Mui. I use she and her pronouns. I'm the director of SNEP, the Stonewall National Education Program. I'm really excited to have y'all here and to be learning and growing throughout this virtual series that we've had. This is just over the midpoint hump of our virtual series. We have a couple more coming up, which I'll talk about later. But just a couple of tech notes. This workshop is being done in webinar format. So unlike some of the other ones we've done, you can see me, I'm the presenter, but you can't see or hear each other. If you do have any questions, please use the chat function. I'll be monitoring the chat for this webinar. If you have any questions or any tech issues, please feel free to chat that, or you can email me and we'll try to make sure that you can access this webinar. We are recording this webinar again for folks who would like to see this later and for folks who aren't able to join us here in this live portion. And yeah, just a reminder again, chat is your space. Please feel free. And if you would like to introduce yourself, to chat your names, your pronouns, where you're coming from into the chat, please feel free to do that as well. It's always nice to see who's coming and where folks are coming from. And without further ado, I will introduce Gracia Magdaleno, they, them. They're an advocate, educator, organizer, and interdisciplinary artist living at the intersections of queer and Latinx identity. Their work focuses on a broad scope of issues, including gender and sexuality, health equity, community mobilization, transformative justice, and trauma-informed care. Gracia's work has been featured in NBC, CNN, Teen Vogue, among others. They hold a Master of Arts in Social Service Administration from the University of Chicago and a Bachelor of Arts in Women and Gender Studies from Arizona State University. They currently serve as the Policy and Advocacy Manager for Illinois Safe Schools Alliance, a program of Public Health Institute of Metropolitan in Chicago, working for school-based communities to promote safe and supportive educational environments for LGBTQ+ youth. We are so excited to have them here, and I will turn this presentation over to you.
Thank you, Bex. I really appreciate that intro. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name again is Gracia Magdaleno, and I use they, them pronouns. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and start the slideshow here from the very beginning. So share screen. Oh, it says that I am not allowed to share my screen. Let's see how we can navigate that.
How is that? Thank y'all for bearing with me.
Oh, it looks like I can do it now.
Beautiful.
Perfect. It worked out perfectly. Okay, so now I'm going to go to the slideshow. All right.
Also really enjoying this virtual background that you have going on. Like you're coming just from a painting. It really.
Okay, let's see. Can you see it? Sounds good. All righty. Well, thank you so much for your patience, everyone. Again, my name is Gracia. It's so great to be here. We're really excited to be working alongside Stonewall National Education Project. It's just really great to be part of it. So we will be talking about the Illinois Inclusive Curriculum Law. And I represent the Illinois Safe Schools Alliance, which is now a program of Public Health Institute of Metropolitan Chicago, based in Chicago, Illinois. So the learning objectives for this presentation are to comprehend the history, specifics, importance, and impact of the law, understand how ultimately affirming learning environments for LGBTQ students make inclusive curriculum more effective. We're going to analyze some frameworks and strategies for implementing inclusive curricula, and then, gain some confidence in accessing things that are already out there that can be used in the classroom. But first, I want to get into the impact of inclusive curriculum on students. So why is inclusive curriculum important? Here's a refresher. Unfortunately, these statistics exist, but we need to go ahead and grapple with them so as to remember why this work is, as it says here, important. So 60% of high school students report hearing anti-LGBTQ language frequently. 35% of LGBTQ students drop out of high school prematurely. 65% of all homeless youth identify as LGBTQ youth, and then LGBTQ youth are 4 times more likely to attempt suicide. And these statistics either come from GLSEN's National School Climate Survey or from the National Coalition for the Homeless, as well as from the CDC's from the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance Report. So ultimately, bringing LGBTQ inclusive curriculum into the classroom creates a school climate that makes it possible to rewrite these statistics, right? Now, according to GLSEN, schools are more affirming when students have access to these things. So the more of these variables and factors that we have, the more that school climate improves, right? So gender and sexuality alliances, GSAs, or similar clubs, supportive school policies and trained and supportive school staff, and curricular resources that are inclusive of LGBTQ identities and topics. So when we have all of these together, it makes for an incredibly affirming, creative, sustainable learning environment for LGBTQ youth and really ultimately for all students. The inclusion of LGBTQ history in curriculum instills in students this intrinsic worth of not just themselves, but of all individuals in the value of a diverse society. It also encourages positive educational outcomes and successes, allows identities of LGBTQ students to be reflected in the classroom, and promotes the creation of a safe and affirming school climate, including lowering rates of bullying, harassment, and intimidation. So we kind of see a ripple effect here. When students are able to see themselves reflected in the classroom, when all students are able to see other people who are like them, not like them, ultimately creates ripple effect where positive outcomes happen. And we see that, again, building into the other ameliorative factors that we saw in the previous slide. Now we're going to go ahead and get into the overview of the inclusive curriculum law. So this is going to go through some history. It's going to go through some of the behind the scenes specifics on the campaign that I'm helping run, as well as parties that were involved and what the law itself is about. So like I said, before delving into specifics, it's important to note the stakeholders that have spearheaded this historical initiative. So as part of Equality Illinois, that's the organization on the far right, and multi-year plan to push for an LGBTQ inclusive curriculum in all Illinois public schools, a partnership was formed with us, Illinois Safe Schools Alliance program with PHIMC, and the Legacy Project, which is another Illinois-based organization that works on LGBTQ inclusion and advocacy. So the 3 of us got together, and the Illinois Inclusive Curriculum Advisory Council was formed and has been gathering as a way to create materials and tools and resources to facilitate the process of implementation, as well as convening community partners to leverage their missions to move the work forward. So these organizations, we gathered together as the Illinois Inclusive Curriculum Advisory Council, and we basically moved the work forward in conjunction with the Illinois State Board of Education, with the Illinois Education Association, Illinois Federation of Teachers. We work with so many different parties across the state. Now this is the timeline. So this is just to give you a background on how it came to be. So in 2017, advocates came together in support of the legislation, and then it was drafted and lobbying began. Then the following year, it was introduced by Representative Anna Moeller and Senator Heather Steens, and it passed in the Senate, but then it didn't go through in the House of Representatives, so it was postponed until 2019. Then it was reintroduced and it passed both in the House and the Senate, and then it was signed into law in August of 2019 by Governor J.B. Pritzker, which is really great. So even though it was signed into law in 2019, there was still parties outside of the legislative process that were deciding how this was going to happen, working alongside legislators, of course, but really taking into account the way in which we know our communities operate and what the needs of LGBTQ students and educators and administrators are. And we were working on this behind the scenes as all of this was happening. So what is the law in Illinois? What is the overview? So it took effect on July 1st, 2020. It mandates that all Illinois public schools include the contributions of LGBT people in the history of Illinois and the US. The mandate applies to grades K through 12, and it requires that textbooks and any other instructional materials must not discriminate against any of the protected classes found under the Illinois Human Rights Act. And it also amends the existing school code and has it works with like a textbook block grant program as well. So that is essentially what the overview is. And then in regards to Illinois Human Rights Act, it includes many different protected classes. So it includes race, color, religion, sex, national origin, citizenship status, ancestry, age, order of protection status. There are many different aspects of it, but then sexual orientation and gender are one of them, among many others. So one question we've been asked is why a mandate? And so knowing the impact and benefit an inclusive curriculum can have for all students, the mandate helps ensure that all students across the state have access to materials and to this sort of teaching. Ultimately, the mandate establishes a sense of responsibility to serve all students in schools. Only a state required mandate would provide educators with a professional directive to incorporate LGBTQ inclusive curriculum into the classroom. And the mandate is essentially meant to reach people who might feel unqualified to teach about this, who lack ready access to tools and resources and need professional development or fear controversy. But that being said, it's an unfunded mandate. So a lot of us have had to think community minded and really pull together resources, pull together tools that exist already. So a lot of what you're going to be seeing here today that we reference as like frameworks and strategies and resources are things that already exist because we recognize the limitations of an unfunded mandate. As grateful as we are to have had this pass, now it's time to really go ahead and strategize together and figure out how we can do this so that it's not a burden on educators, right? Ultimately, school districts, because it's an unfunded mandate or because the language of the law is written as such, they determine how the content is taught. So there's not one right way, right? And it suggests that content be taught in social sciences, but it doesn't limit this content to that. And it also doesn't require the purchase of new textbooks. With that being said, there are lots of free resources and tools available to support schools. Although school districts determine how the content is taught, that's where the Illinois Inclusive Curriculum Law Advisory Council comes in, because we are helping folks to kind of figure out how to successfully fulfill the requirements of the mandate and meet the age appropriate needs of students. And we're also working on ways to expand that outside of social sciences. And it also does another thing. So it doesn't change the Illinois State Board of Education learning standards, and it also doesn't provide any authority for ISB, Illinois State Board of Education, to change the standards to reflect the law's provisions. So it goes both ways. And ultimately, it's an amendment to the Illinois School Code in that it mandates the study of the roles and contributions of LGBTQ people. And it's a compass for educational supplements, which means that educators and administrators can have self-determination on what they're creating and using. And it's not a requirement to buy new textbooks necessarily, and it's not a costly mandate because, like I said, most materials are low cost, if not free. So what this means for educators is that they have an opportunity to present material and supplements in a way that reflects the unique nature of their classroom, especially for queer students. So that means that depending on what your school district looks like, we can work with you to be tailored just so to exactly what it is that your classroom needs. So you may be wondering, how is it that I or educators in Illinois can integrate the content into existing curricula, and what additional resources are available? So we are going to get into that. So the first thing that I want to cover before getting into frameworks and strategies is like approaches to LGBTQ inclusive classrooms and curriculum by going into laying the foundation of this by thinking about the approach to affirming learning environments. So the goal isn't for you to walk away from this presentation today and feel like you've got it all in as to how to create an affirming environment. It's just more so this is giving you a peek into some of the practices we believe in and have used in the professional development that we provide as a way to start the conversation in your classroom, or to think more broadly about what strategies you've been thinking about in creating affirming learning environments outside of inclusive curriculum. So the first thing is to really examine your own personal beliefs and professional responsibility to your students. We all show up with biases, right? Understanding the importance of language and being willing to learn essential terms, because we know that language changes a lot, especially with, the young people that we work with. It's, new language happens on the daily, right? In regards to like queer identity or identity relating to sexual orientation and gender identity. You also want to be able to assess your practices to ensure inclusion for all students and to challenge like the binary or anything that's a norm or practice that's gendered. And then you also want to spot and integrate opportunities for dialogue and learning to really encourage there to be curiosity and questions and welcoming that in the space, and then ultimately integrating LGBTQ inclusive content into curriculum. So the first approach that we take to building an inclusive curriculum is by thinking about the difference between personal belief and professional responsibility. So you can see that there's this arrow here, and it's not to say that the arrow always flows one way. I think there can be a back and forth, right? But ultimately it's about understanding the expectations of, as an educator or an administrator, understanding the expectations of your environment, where professionally, like where you work, and what that means to accept those expectations in relation to the young people that you're going to be teaching. And then recognizing that code switching might occur between the home environment and school environment so that you can best serve your students. So ultimately, this model just shows how our belief systems impact our professions. And by code switching, it means like having multiple identities in the role of it. So what it's like for adults to be at work versus home, and also what it means for young people to be at home versus school. So the ways in which we show up with our identities in those different environments, right? And so being cognizant of that will help us to approach this notion of professional responsibility with more compassion, with more understanding, and with more patience, ultimately, because it's a process. It doesn't happen all at once. Then there's the importance of language. So, being intentional about the language that you use. There's this really great photograph or image that you can see on the right of this slide that kind of gives you an idea of how to degender language, especially language that we've used for a really long time, right? So making sure to engage your students in conversations around the evolution of identity-based language, especially when introducing primary source material with inclusive curriculum that you have. So I'm trying to think of an example, but why is it that when we're thinking about the titles Mr., Mrs., Miss, where do those come from, and like why is it that there are 4 of them, and like what does the introduction of mix mean now, right? So that's kind of like a lesson plan that you could have. Also being proactive with pronouns, so making it a norm, whether it's in the classroom or on Zoom or Google meetings, to go ahead and place your pronouns in the name, which I realized like I didn't do that for mine, so I apologize. And you know what I'm gonna do is I'm actually going to do that now, because I think it's super important, and I'm glad I caught that. So there I am. I went ahead and changed my pronouns. Sorry, I went back to the next slide without meaning to. And then challenging yourself to be more aware of gendered language overall. And we'll get into that a little bit more, but ultimately, when we think about language, it can be easy to get tripped up and like try to do the right thing. And it ultimately can result in like feeling paralyzed or feeling like you can't act. But as educators, as administrators, as advocates, we have the luxury of ongoing relationships with students in our care. So this allows for reflection and revisiting. And it means that if we make a mistake, we have the opportunity to just move on and not make a big deal out of it and like course correct. And then if there is something that the student wants to talk about, opening up a dialogue and how to rectify it. So ultimately think about like, are these things appropriate? Does it include everyone? Who does it leave behind? Like those are questions that we should be asking ourselves. Think about like what your own identities are and how they impact the conversation, and what are your own connections to LGBTQ issues and identities. Affirming, you know, pronouns, even if they change day to day for some students, even if they decide that they don't want to go by you know, a certain name one day, like what does it look like to affirm that? And ultimately, like I said, just having patience, because this takes time and effort. So these are some like flows to show you what like gender affirming curricular and educational practices can look like outside of language, for example. So meet your students where you're at is the first thing that I would suggest. So we know that young people aren't a monolith, right? And so we should focus on the idea that all people have individual likes and dislikes, and we should exemplify that idea by identifying the differences and similarities between like you and your students. How does that make you feel? But whatever arises, like being gentle with yourself and continuing to challenge these stereotypes and binary thinking with concrete counterexamples. So the first one that I can think of that's the easiest is like the gendered practice of boys lining up here, girls lining up here. Like, how does that make you feel as an educator or an administrator? How can you like build a space or create an environment where that can include everyone, not just boys and girls, because there are some that don't fit in those categories. So that's what I mean by like meeting students where they're at, is really like putting yourself in their shoes, really thinking about like what purpose does this serve. Then also respecting privacy. So you should not inform, I'm sure you all know this, but you should not inform a parent or guardian of their child's LGBTQ identity without the student's consent, given that elements of a student's identity may be site specific. Like I said, like some students might decide to use one name or one set of pronouns in one place and another in a different place. So that's just something we like to say as well when you're creating an affirming environment. And then ultimately creating a safe space. And I know that people say that all the time, but what does it look like to really affirm young people's resilience and creativity and navigating systemic barriers? Ultimately, just show that you're a safe person to talk to by having your practice reflect your knowledge. In addition to the points that I just made in the last slide, there's also best practices provided by the Affirming and Inclusive Schools Task Force to Governor J.B. Pritzker, titled in a report, Strengthening Inclusion in Illinois Schools. And it's a free report. Anybody can access it, which is really great. And these are some of the points that they have. So providing ongoing training to all staff members. So that's professional development, right? So we think regular training is an essential part of preventing like discrimination and harassment, and then makes it easier for you to get into building inclusive curriculum in the classroom. Also creating non-punitive environments focused on prevention. So thinking about education and positive behavioral interventions and supports rather than exclusionary discipline. And that can also be built into your curriculum, right? Like elements of restorative justice that we believe in. Illinois Safe Schools Alliance like holds that as a value. And so we think that that is something that you can also, that we think is part of like LGBTQ history, is like, what does it look like for people not to be disposable? And so inserting that into your curriculum. Then ensuring accountability for inclusive practices. So what does it look like for restoration to happen when an employee fails to meet the expectations of the district's policy and procedures, right? And what does accountability look like? What does it look like in a way that is like not just effective, but also prompt, right? So just thinking about like what handbooks look like in relation to inclusive curriculum as well. Like if you're including inclusive curriculum in your classroom, like what about your handbooks, right? Like thinking about those things as well. Providing easily accessible information and supports, because we know that students hold multiple identities, and making sure that the information is accessible to everyone, and accessible meaning, you know, that it's easy to find, easy to reach. And then ultimately being clear about expectations. So if you as an educator and administrator know what it is that you're walking into, or rather know what it is that you want walking into, the classroom or the school environment, it makes it so much easier, right? So I recommend, we'll go into this a little bit later, but like really working the mind through like visual aspects or something tactile with your hands can really help if you are able to use them. So that is something that we will get into later as well, that I just want to bring up kind of as a note right now. Just really quickly, for a more in-depth professional development session on our frameworks, you can just go to illinoissafeschools.org, which is our website, and then there's a tab for professional development. Okay, so now we're actually going to get into inclusive curriculum itself. So thank you for your patience in regards to learning a little bit more about the foundations, but now we can get into like the meat and potatoes. So this quote that you see here, when someone with the authority of a teacher describes the world and you're not in it, there's a moment of psychic disequilibrium as if you looked in the mirror and saw nothing. And that's by Adrienne Rich. So this quote really exemplifies why it's so important to provide students, especially LGBTQ students, with an inclusive curriculum. So the theory in this next slide supports the importance of representation in the classroom. So we've got this framework that we've adapted from GLSEN. It's curriculum as mirrors and windows. So students will basically see themselves reflected in the classroom with inclusive curriculum. And other students who don't identify that way will be able to look into the identities of others and build acceptance and build not just tolerance, but acceptance. And will also give them an opportunity to really question stereotypes and things of that nature. So I just like to bring up this image because I think it's really powerful, and that's the way that we like to think of inclusive curriculum. And then the second theory that we really use it's a theory, but like that we use as a framework in regards to inclusive curriculum is intersectionality. So the way that we approach inclusive curriculum is through an intersectional lens, and it has to account for different identities depending on like the nature of the classroom and even people who aren't represented in the classroom, right? So you're seeing here the intersections of many different parts of life. So for example, there might be a lesson that you want to teach that is about sexual orientation and gender identity, but then what would it look like for you to note or talk also about their disability status or their race or their occupation, right? Like all of these different aspects to learn more about privilege and have your students learn more about privilege and oppression, really. We really recommend that if you're not necessarily familiar with the notion of intersectionality, that you take a look at Kimberly Crenshaw, who is the theorist who came up with this notion of intersectionality. And then there's a video that I realized it's okay. I don't remember. I think it's Learning for Justice. I think it's not Teaching Tolerance anymore, as far as I know. But they have a really great video on intersectionality that unfortunately we can't play. But this is what it looks like, just so that you have it for reference. Alrighty. And then the other framework that we use is inquiry-based learning. So a lot of you, if you're watching this and you're an educator, you might already know this and be using it. But again, these are methods and dispositions that students need to develop in order to be equipped for life, basically. And this is what they are. So essentially developing questions and planning inquiries, evaluating sources and using evidence, and then communicating conclusions and taking informed actions. And there are like sub-bullets beneath that to show you like what that process can look like. But yeah, we just bring this up as a framework because LGBTQ history and all that it involves really does involve like curiosity and like dialogue. And so if you're already using an inquiry-based framework, then just kind of like build off of that. We really encourage you to look for tools and resources that exist, and then see how you can like couple that with your inquiry-based learning that you already have. Thank you for sharing the video, Bex. I really appreciate it. All right, so I'll move on to the next slide. And then for strategies, So what we decided to do was align it with the Illinois Learning Standards. So we recommend that to start, alignment and integration with the learning standards like is recommended. Maybe that's not the way like other states operate, or we know that, you know, this is our approach might be different than California and New Jersey, but this is sort of the flow that we decided to go with. And this is just a flow chart to show you like what it looks like in social sciences, and it goes down to history perhaps, but it's not exhaustive, right? So this is how we read our standards in Illinois. So this is just like a very small section, but essentially it's got, you know, the topic, the discipline rather, and it's got like the subject, and then the number of the standard and the grade level. And so it's like public information. You can look this up online on the Illinois State Board of Education. And essentially, we have gone through it and just kind of laid out ways that we can do curricular inclusion like through the standards, because we figured that would be easiest and would require less of a burden for teachers. So this is an example of social science integration and alignment in 4th grade. So this scope and sequence kind of serves as an example of how to approach integration. So the headings are based off of sections from the Illinois Learning Standards for History. Like I said, a PDF exists on ISB's website titled Illinois Learning Standards for Social Science, essentially. And we really ask that you just take what resonates with you and you leave the rest. I also want to recall that like many educators are already doing this work. This was just kind of the way that we perceived it. So this is a section titled Historical Sources and Evidence. And then it says, using artifacts and primary sources, investigate how individuals contributed to the founding and development of Illinois. So for us, it was like, oh, Jane Addams is a really great example. So for integration, asking the question in an appropriate manner, how did Jane Addams and her life contribute to the founding and development of Illinois? And then perhaps, you know, when we were in person, like taking a trip to the whole house, right? But then how to talk about Jane Addams as an LGBT figure, we figured like, you know, it's really simple. You can use like terms like, you know, who was Jane Addams building a home with? Like, who did Jane Addams like? Who's Jane Addams in love with, right? Like thinking about ways to go ahead and frame the conversation with your students is a lot easier than you think. And I like to put in It's Elementary. It's a really great resource on how to start the conversation about sexual orientation. Additionally, we have a lesson plan from the Legacy Project, who's our partner for Jane Addams. So we can provide examples of their lesson plans in future slides. Then we have addressing questions and pushback as another strategy. So sometimes you're trying to implement inclusive curriculum and you're having to deal with pushback on the outside, right? And so we really, as a resource, encourage you, I'm not going to read both of these quotes, but these are talking points to support educators when asked about the age appropriateness of LGBTQ inclusion. And it's GLSEN's developing LGBTQ inclusive classroom resources. And we refer to it time and time again. We're actually using it to kind of finish up this implementation guidance document that we've been working on for the past year. So it's just really great to be able to look at GLSEN and kind of use that as a model and really adapt it to what Illinois needs. So I highly recommend that you do so as well if you're needing some inspiration. Now we have the 9th through 12th grade alignment and integration example. So for grades 9 through 12, it's all about the evolution of modern LGBT communities and identities, 20th century persecution of sexual and gender minorities, and the growth of the LGBT civil rights movement. And under change, continuity, and context, it would be evaluating historical developments being shaped by time and place, as well as broader historical context, analyzing change and continuity within and across historical areas, and evaluating methods utilized by people and institutions to promote change. A mouthful, right? And that's a lot, but like we really break it down and think that it can just be based in inquiry-based learning, and it could be using tools and resources that already exist, and just really like asking questions, right? It's like a critical question and then building the lesson plan off of that. So what factors have led to the gradual acceptance of the LGBT community? How did the 20th century views differ from that of the 21st century? How did this manifest in certain laws or policies? What is the Kinsey scale and what does it measure? So these are some of the questions that we've built in into sections like this. So again, working smarter, not harder, and working with our partners. There's a lesson plan from our family coalition, which is working out of California. And so again, we're still trying to acquire the resources and infrastructure to go ahead and create our own. Well, we have our own lesson plans, but in regards to, an example like the Kinsey scale, like we have, these partners in California who have a lesson plan on Kinsey and heteronormativity, which could be great for high schoolers, right? And in regards to historical events, to answer the other questions, there's a plethora of them. So these are historical events that you could pull from. And this really encourages educators and administrators to kind of learn for the sake of learning for themselves and for their students. I know that might sound like, oh, more work, right? But it really is fascinating. Like when you think about how much history there is that hasn't been tapped into and talked about in classrooms, it really is kind of exciting because you're basically paving the way. So anyway, we've brought up a couple of examples here for you too, of like historical events that you could use to talk about in your high school. And then another strategy that we've thought about is like the James Banks approach. He was a theorist who specialized in the practice of multicultural education. So his theories have really inspired other states that have also passed laws around inclusive curriculum. And there are 4 levels of integration. So you can see them here. It's like there's contributions, additive, transformation, and social action. So the point is that you build on these layers to go ahead and get your students engaged depending on like the grade level that they're in. So this is a lesson plan from the Legacy Project, our partner. So they have the contributions approach for Bayard Rustin, who is, it was a Black queer organizer. And this is an example of like the lesson plan, depending on the level of depth that you want to go into. So then you get into levels 3 and 4. And then making sure to use the standards as a framework too, you can use their questions and prompts to meet them through this lesson plan. These can easily be applied to the subject of history and they're free of cost. You can find them on the Legacy Project's website, which we'll get to as a link later. But this is what they look like. They're a wonderful resource to start the process of implementation with middle and high school students. We don't necessarily want you to read these on the screen, but just for you to gain like a high level overview of what they look like and how you can access them through the website. There are 50 available in the database so far. I'm pretty sure there are more. Victor, our partner, Victor Salvo, the founder and executive director, is constantly working on improving the website. They're our biggest resource for like Illinois specific like lesson plans, not Illinois specific, but rather like a resource that Illinois has created. Excuse me. And all the lessons are prepared by a professional with either a doctorate or an EDD in education. Free of charge, searchable. They're on like in a matrix as a way to identify the K-12 lesson plans. So it goes through individuals, Illinois standard codes, academic subject matter, grade level in school, related fields of contribution, and general demographics, which we think is amazing. And then we have key approaches, which is another like strategy and framework. So thinking about stepping outside of history, we can also think about like, well, where's the next subject that I could teach this in? And like, English is a really great place to do that. And so I went ahead and placed the next slide as a way to kind of buffer the conversation, is to get you moving and thinking through these things. And then I'll move into resources. But English, just, I mention it because it's a great way to introduce your students to authors and themes and books, and compare depictions of queer characters in different contexts, like through a story, right? Like having story time in a classroom is like, I remember it being one of my fondest memories. And it's a really great way to learn about other identities and also to build camaraderie. You can explore different representations of gender through the spoken word. Speeches, discussions, and writing activities can be done. And you can also teach it in like grammar and language, because we've just been talking about pronouns. You could talk about like as a lesson plan, it's like why the singular they actually works, right? And, why Merriam-Webster now has it as like, featured in their dictionary as such. So there are many different ways to like kind of tie history and English together. They just kind of go hand in hand. So this is just a reminder that if you're interested in like doing something outside of history, English is a really great like key approach as well. And then before I get into like examples of that, This next slide is, this is the aspect of like visual note taking that you might have, one of the reasons you might have signed up for, but this is an exercise that I often, as an illustrator on the side, engage in myself, which is called a mind map. So a mind map is a really great exercise that you can do not only with yourself as like an educator or an administrator or someone who is interested in LGBTQ inclusive curriculum, but also with your students. So this is an example of a mind map. So basically what you do is you start off in the middle with something that's on your mind, a question that you want to have answered or you want to explore more of, or a topic, what have you. So for me, I use the example of the Illinois Inclusive Curriculum Law, and then my thoughts just kind of led me all over the place. And what I've been able to do is by doing this, I'm able to draw connections. I'm able to bring up questions outside of me that like maybe I hadn't communicated before, realities, fantasies, resources that exist. And I do that all by drawing these lines, right? And so mind mapping is a really great exercise that I highly recommend. And I'd be happy to connect offline as to, you know, how to think through that. But this is just my interpretation of this presentation in relation to a mind map and how to like use visual note taking as a way to really help you move through this prospect of creating inclusive curriculum. Like if nothing else, if you don't know how to do this, that's great. Start with a mind map. Like I highly, highly recommend that. I think it's a tool that a lot of educators like that we don't necessarily like tap into as much. And so I just wanted to bring this notion up of like, we can really do this in a creative way before we actually get to the hard work of like constructing lesson plans or pulling all these together into a syllabus, what have you. So I just wanted to bring this up. Alrighty, now we get back to the examples. So in regards to English, there's plenty that exists, as I'm sure most of you know, in elementary and middle school, as well as in high school. More books than ever before that feature characters that are LGBTQ. And it's a wonderful way of reflecting the identities and can be done across all grade levels, which is really great. So when people are like, well, is there such thing as age appropriate, you know, stuff out there for my kid? Absolutely there is. We're seeing more and more coming out every day. And in fact, one day I would really like to publish and am working on trying to self-publish a children's book on trans identity. It's like, it's, you know, up and coming. People are realizing how important it is. And so, yeah, it definitely exists and there's more than you can count out there. So no fear in trying to find that. Now we just go into regular resources that exist. Also, Bex, if you wouldn't mind in the chat plugging in just quickly. Oh, it's from Learning for Justice. Okay, never mind. So it did confirm what I thought. I just wanted to let you all know that in the next slide, Learning for Justice resources are on there, and Bex will give more resources. I just wanted to let you know that there's a misnomer. We didn't update the name. Just want to let you know that. But yeah, with GLSEN, there's many different lesson plans and resources. And these are just some of the examples that we decided to pull up, like Ready, Set, Respect, Identity Flowers, Challenging Assumptions, Learning Empowerment and Self-Identification. Like, feel free to go on GLSEN and go into the treasure trove that they are for LGBTQ inclusive learning opportunities. And they are also definable by subject area and grade. Then we have Learning for Justice, which as I said, I apologize that I don't have the up-to-date name on it, but they also have learning plans. So as you can see here, they align with our notion of inquiry-based learning and can be filtered by grade. So there's that. You can see this is an example of like what it looks like. It also might be updated to look different than this, but you can see there's like intersectionality woven into it as well. And let's see here. In the next one, we also tapped back into addressing questions and pushback. The reason why we have it at the end of this is because we really want to encourage you to start a dialogue with the folks in your schools who perhaps, you know, you may be coming into this thinking, well, I'm just one person, like it's not necessarily my district that's, you know, on board, right? And so tapping back into this, developing LGBTQ inclusive classroom resources, like this is a really great tool for you to look at and kind of use to reflect along with your mind mapping to be able to think about how to bring this up to the folks who hold power in your institutions, or the way that you can start talking to parents, to community members who might not be as supportive, or like who might not know, but like are on board. They just like need to know more information. So we just wanted to place this on here as well. Here are additional resources. So I can share this out. I can also just leave it on the screen for a minute or two, but these resources are what we've been pulling from, and they're a really great place to start. We really reference other tools that are related to inclusive curriculum, but aren't necessarily explicitly related, such as like gender support plans from Gender Spectrum. So that's a really great example of a resource that we've been using and that we refer back to time and time again. We also have like state-specific resources like this one on remote learning during COVID-19. So we'd like to preface that we don't know yet how schools are going to reopen. Like it's still changing day to day. Even, you know, given the fact that we have vaccinations, right? Our information is limited with variants. And so we just want to like respect that and name that. But we pulled from the Chicago Public Schools in the remote learning guidance for educators. They basically laid out these couple of, or not couple of, but they laid out best practices and strategies for how to engage in remote learning. And it's still a reality now. And so we just like to bring up, or I'm sorry, not CPS, Illinois State Board of Education, I'm so sorry, brought up the notion of remote learning. And so this report I think is really handy. And so some of these bullet points that you see here, that it has to be equitable and respect the needs of all students, lining up with IEPs and Section 504 plans, things that are age appropriate and active student engagement, content that meets all standards, consistent communication with students and their parents. This is all not new, right? We know this, but I think it's just important when we're thinking about inclusive curriculum as being accessible. That means it has to also be accessible to those who can't come into schools regularly because of whatever regarding COVID-19 or not, right? So like, how do we reach out to those who are most vulnerable? And that's just something I like to bring up. And lastly, why now? So queer folks, LGBTQ people, they're part of society. We always have been, and more young people are identifying as such. They're starting to realize that they belong to this community, right? So if we ever hope to stop the tide of violence and discrimination and lack of sense of self the LGBTQ youth are experiencing, we have to change the messages that all students receive and create affirming learning environments in the process. So reintegration of LGBT contributions to history, and I put LGBT at the end because that's what our law says is LGBT, but I believe it should be Q as well, to history and culture through the classroom is one way to begin the work. So ultimately, this is transformational work. It's work that is going to have to be something we dedicate ourselves to, something that is different than anything we've done before. Because if we're thinking about LGBTQ identity, I don't know who's watching. I believe perhaps some of my coworkers might be watching, and if they are, they're like, "Oh, Gracia loves to say this, but I really do." It's that I like to engage in work that is transformational, not transactional. So it's not just about like, okay, how can I get my paycheck and how can I like, you know, teach these kids what they need to know, I guess, according to Illinois learning standards. No, it's so much more. We're giving young people through this lens of LGBTQ inclusive curriculum an opportunity to just rewire their entire brain and like think of the world from a completely different perspective, one that we believe is the alliance is rooted in our values, which is about anti-oppression. It's about body positivity. It's about restorative justice. It's about being trauma informed, right? Those are the values we live through. And when we're thinking about inclusive curriculum, we also highly recommend that you think about, you know, mind mapping, perhaps like what it looks like to work through those values in regards to building inclusive curriculum, like working through your values first, like what are you as an educator or an administrator value in the classroom, and how is that going to impact the way that you use the millions of resources that we have. So with that being said, I'm gonna just, I know I'm at 45, which might leave me with some time, but I'll stop there. If you have any questions or you want to get involved, please feel free to contact me. This is my email that you can find. You can go ahead and contact me as a way to get involved directly with like the guidance that we're developing, or to offer resources of your own. We're always looking for educators who, want to have one-on-ones with us, or administrators who want to like build a coalition with us. And also feel free to check out our partners' websites as well. That would be really helpful. The Legacy Project is one of them. Equality Illinois is another. And then there's us through PHIMC. You can just find our website through there. And then these are references just so that you know that we backed it up with literature. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn it back over to Bex, but I have the slides here. I'm sorry that I couldn't take it out of our like format, so I hope it's okay.
No worries at all. Thank you so much for that incredible presentation. I was taking all the notes on this side. It's really wonderful to see the ways that you both showed your foundation, shared so many available resources. I'm sure folks are also, like me, so excited to see how many free and available resources are, and the way that you explained how you're tying that into the standards. We see these state-based policies being passed, more and more, but the gap between that policy passing and the implementation can really be so wide. So I really appreciate you sharing both the frameworks for how you're doing this and some really extensive examples of how it's being put in place. So very excited. A lot of the things I'll, kind of share here, and yeah, no worries about the format, but have already been mentioned, which I love. I love seeing collaboration. It's also really fun for me because I used to work at GLSEN and helped create some of those resources, and that identity flowers is like a lesson I taught like to my third graders that I brought to GLSEN to like see it here. So some of those things are just so sweet for me on the side. But yeah, love this work, love the ideas of coalition building. I think there is just so much work that we can do together. And so grateful to have you here. I'll just highlight a couple of other resources too, particularly around history. If you're looking for it, I wanted to mention the Quist app. It is a way, especially we're in virtual learning, that has some LGBTQ centered history. Outwards also has free videos. So it's a project that folks took videos and interviews of like a variety of different LGBTQ like elders and telling their stories. And so I recommend that for folks that are looking to bring that into your classroom. I will highlight also Welcoming Schools, which is an HRC program, particularly for elementary folks. We never know where you're going to get. As an elementary school former teacher, I always must share the importance of starting this work in K-5, the importance of setting that foundation, and how incredible it is that we have so many resources that are really, as you mentioned, kind of developmentally tailored and appropriate for young folks on pronouns, on identity, on families. So Welcoming Schools and also GLSEN has both elementary, middle, and high school lessons. And I did, the learning practices are new.
Oh, yes, sorry.
No worries. You've kind of mentioned that earlier, but yes, have to just highlight. I also still call them teaching tools. And then, I'll look at the Stonewall. I wanted to just mention, folks, that also the Stonewall National Museum and Archives is an incredible resource. If you are close to Florida and are able to bring your class there, or are looking for a place to really be immersed in the archives, highly recommend. And for the rest of us, I'm actually in Oakland on Ohlone land out here, so not one of those fortunate folks. And so if you're like me, you might want to look at stonewall.nma.org, which is a way to work through Stonewall's virtual archives. They are categorized in these different ways that you'll see here, but it's a great way to look either for yourself to see what you might supplement your curriculum with, but also if you want to do kind of a web quest or a search with your students, this is available and free and has a great picture into the museum and archives. And I did want to highlight some exciting news that we do have a conference that we're planning on inclusive curriculum. So if you are here because you're working on this, or watching this later because you're interested in more ways to both create or have professional development around or resource sharing around inclusive curriculum, we'll be having both virtual and hopefully, all things going according to plan, in-person opportunities to come together in the spring. In March or April with a focus on inclusive curriculum. And I think I'll talk more about that in the next. Yes, I will. Great. So this, hopefully this will still work in a smaller spot, but you should be able to scan this, and we would love to keep you informed around this conference. There's also an opportunity for a teaching fellowship for folks that are interested in coming to the archives, to look through the archives and to create some curriculum to bring back to your classrooms. And so those are some exciting opportunities. And if you'd like to stay posted with that, or if you'd like to, just stay up to date with the virtual symposium that we have running till the end of December, please feel free to snap that with your phone, or we'll share the link as well. But that's a way to both stay posted with these events, and also we are looking for some folks to join our advisory committee, or to just give feedback as we shape this new focus for the conference. So if you're interested in that, we'd love to be connected. All right. Thank you so much. And if we do have a few minutes left. If folks have any questions, please feel free to chat them. Don't want to cut you short, but again, just wanted to say thank you so much, Gracia, for being here. It's been a really incredible time. I know I've learned a lot. I'm sure folks have learned a lot. And yeah, thank you everyone who's been here to take this time with us today.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I had a blast. Love talking about this stuff.